Greg Harris was a beloved teacher, Lily Harris was a bright young graduate, and Margaret Harris was the devoted wife and mother who held them both together until one night, she picked up a gun and ended everything. Behind the doors of their perfect suburban home, a forbidden secret had been growing in the shadows. What Margaret uncovered shattered her reality and her family forever. The Harris family lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside of Aurora, Colorado, where the streets were lined with trimmed hedges, American flags, and the faint scent of barbecue on warm weekends. Their two-story colonial house sat on the corner lot, always immaculately clean, the garden carefully tended by Margaret Harris herself. She was known among neighbors as friendly but firm, a respected nurse at the local hospital with over 20 years of experience. Her husband, Greg Harris, taught English literature at the nearby high school, where students appreciated his calm demeanor and dry sense of humor. Their only daughter, Lily, had recently moved back home after completing her degree in marketing from the state university. At 23, she was full of ambition, charm, and energy, bringing a vibrant presence into the house after years of being away. On the surface, everything about the Harris family looked flawless. They went to church on Sundays, hosted neighborhood cookouts in the summer, and posted regular family photos on social media. Greg often quoted poetry in his captions. Margaret would comment with a heart or a scripture. Lily would occasionally share selfies of herself with her parents, always smiling, always grateful. To their friends, co-workers, and even extended relatives, the Harrises were an example of what a stable, successful, loving family should look like. But beneath the carefully polished appearance, cracks were beginning to form, ones Margaret couldn't ignore any longer. It started with little things. One evening, Margaret came home from work early and noticed the living room light on, though she remembered turning it off. The television was off, but a wine glass was on the coffee table, just one. She found Greg upstairs in his study, reading, and Lily was supposedly out with a friend. It didn't seem like a big deal, but something about it made Margaret uneasy. Then there were the late-night conversations. Margaret would occasionally wake up to hear muffled voices coming from downstairs. Sometimes the garage door would creak open past midnight. Every time she asked about it, she was met with casual excuses. Lily couldn't sleep. Greg was checking the furnace. They were just having tea. The explanations were always reasonable, yet the behavior became more frequent. Margaret dismissed her suspicions for a while. She reminded herself that Lily was an adult now, back home during a transitional period in her life, and Greg was just being a supportive father. Maybe she was reading too much into it. After all, didn't families get closer during hard times? Lily had gone through a rough breakup a few months earlier, and Greg had always been her emotional anchor. Maybe it was just that. Margaret kept repeating that to herself over and over like a prayer. But soon, the distance between Margaret and Greg became harder to ignore. They used to talk late into the night about work, politics, books, and weekend plans. Now, Greg seemed distracted, withdrawn. He barely looked at Margaret during dinner. He stopped initiating date nights, forgot their anniversary, and started sleeping in a separate room due to supposed back pain. Even Lily, once so affectionate and open with her mother, had grown colder. She avoided eye contact, kept her phone glued to her hand, and spent more time locked in her garage apartment behind the main house. Margaret began to feel like a stranger in her own home. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, Margaret found Greg's phone charging on the counter. The screen was unlocked. At first, she simply wanted to check the time, but as she reached for it, a message popped up, a heart emoji from Lily. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers moved on their own. She opened the messaging app. The thread was long, too long. Pages of messages exchanged at all hours, some playful, others poetic, some suggestive in a way no father and daughter should ever speak. Margaret scrolled and scrolled, her heart pounding in her chest. The more she read, the more her hands shook. There were inside jokes she didn't understand, nicknames she'd never heard Greg use before, plans to meet while she was at work, comments about clothing, looks, touches. Then came the photos. They weren't outright indecent, but they were intimate. Lily lying on her bed in a tank top, hair messy. Greg smiling at her from across the table, captioned with a wink emoji. Margaret's eyes blurred as tears welled up, but she kept scrolling. There was a message from Lily that read, "I wish we didn't have to pretend." Another from Greg, "One day, maybe we won't." It felt like a punch to the gut. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. Was it real? Could this be some twisted joke? A misunderstanding? But there were too many messages, too many timestamps, too much evidence. Her instincts, long ignored, came roaring back with horrifying clarity. She deleted nothing. Instead, she took screenshots of everything and emailed them to herself, hiding them in a password-protected folder on her laptop. She tried to go about her day as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Her home felt cold. The sound of Greg's voice made her skin crawl. When Lily came into the kitchen and smiled at her, Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, eyes open in the dark, trying to understand how this had happened under her roof. Her mind flipped through memories like a slideshow: Lily's first steps, school plays, family vacations. She remembered the moment Greg had held Lily for the first time in the hospital, the way he cried, the way he kissed her forehead. It had all seemed so real, so full of love. Had it always been a lie? The next day, Margaret began to notice even more details that once went unnoticed. Lily wore Greg's old hoodie around the house. Greg had saved a photo of Lily as his phone wallpaper. There were late-night whispers, laughter behind closed doors. Margaret started writing it all down in a notebook, the dates, the times, the details. If no one else believed her, she would make sure the truth couldn't be denied. Still, there was a part of her, deep down, that hoped it wasn't true. That maybe she had imagined it, that the stress of her job, her age, her own insecurities were warping her perception. But the evidence kept growing, piling up in secret folders and notebooks, stacking higher and heavier on her conscience. She couldn't unsee what she had seen, and she couldn't unfeel the betrayal. A part of her still loved them both: Greg, the man who had stood by her for decades, and Lily, the daughter she had raised with everything she had. But another part of her had begun to rot, poisoned by suspicion, heartache, and rage. The family was still intact on the outside. To the neighbors, they were still picture perfect. But inside the Harris home, the silence had become deafening. The smiles were forced. And Margaret, once a proud, nurturing mother and wife, had started to unravel one stolen truth at a time. Margaret's world had quietly split in two. There was the version everyone else still saw, the calm, respectable nurse holding her family together. And then there was the private world inside her head, one filled with burning questions, invisible wounds, and a slow-building storm she could no longer control. The knowledge of what she had uncovered poisoned everything around her. Each time she looked at Greg or Lily, the memory of those messages came flooding back. The words, the images, the twisted affection, it was all there, playing on a loop, infecting every moment of her life. She didn't confront them right away. Not because she was scared, but because she wasn't sure what confrontation would even solve. Margaret had always believed in fixing things. At the hospital, she was the one patients trusted, most clear-headed, experienced, efficient. But nothing in her life had prepared her for something like this. Every night she lay awake, going over the evidence, trying to make sense of the situation. She replayed moments from the past year, thinking back to when Lily moved back home. There had been no obvious warning signs, no shouting matches, no tears or slamming doors, only silence. A silence that now felt loaded with secrets. She watched them differently now. Every touch, every glance, every movement between Greg and Lily seemed wrong. They cooked dinner together too often, stood too close in the kitchen, laughed at things Margaret didn't understand. Lily no longer called Greg Dad unless others were around. When they were alone, Margaret noticed she sometimes used his first name. She noticed Greg looking at Lily in ways that made her stomach turn, not with fatherly affection, but with admiration, longing, and something else she couldn't even name. One afternoon, while pretending to sort laundry, Margaret found a pair of unfamiliar earrings tucked in Greg's sock drawer. They were delicate and expensive-looking, not something Lily would normally wear. There was also a bottle of perfume in the garage apartment that Margaret hadn't seen before. She checked the trash can and found a used condom wrapper. Her heart thudded with a sickening rhythm, and she felt her knees weaken. It was no longer a suspicion, it was reality. She began documenting everything. Every item, every interaction, every late-night movement. She installed a small voice recorder near the kitchen and placed a hidden camera in the hallway where Greg and Lily often passed by. She didn't want to believe what she would hear or see, but something inside her needed proof, not for anyone else, but for herself. She needed to make sure she wasn't losing her mind. One night, Greg claimed he was going to meet a colleague at a bar to discuss the school's upcoming curriculum changes. Margaret nodded, said nothing, and watched him leave. An hour later, she slipped out and drove slowly around the neighborhood, parking a few houses down from her own. She turned off her headlights and waited. It was late, almost midnight, when she saw Greg returning home, not through the front door, but through the side gate that led to the garage apartment. A soft light flickered on through the window. It stayed on for hours. She drove back to her parking spot, walked in through the front door like a ghost, and sat in the dark living room until dawn. The next morning, she said nothing. Just made coffee, packed her lunch, and left for work. By now, the weight of her secret knowledge was turning into physical pain. She developed migraines, stomach cramps, and found it difficult to eat. Her coworkers noticed her change in demeanor, once cheerful and focused, now hollow and distracted. But Margaret had learned how to fake normal. At work, she smiled. At home, she pretended, but inside she was rotting with rage. Then came the discovery that pushed her over the edge. While helping Lily clean out an old storage box from her college days, Margaret stumbled across an unopened envelope marked Personal DNA Results. It was dated from 2 years ago. She felt a chill creep down her spine. Lily noticed her holding the envelope and quickly snatched it back, laughing nervously, saying it was just something silly for a class project. But Margaret had already memorized the lab's name. Later that night, she searched the name online, called the number, and requested a duplicate report, pretending to be Lily. When the document arrived days later, Margaret opened it in the privacy of her car, parked far from home. It confirmed that Greg Harris was not Lily's biological father. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the paper. Her vision blurred. She was back in time, 24 years earlier, to a one-night mistake she had buried so deep she thought it no longer existed. She had never told Greg. She had convinced herself it didn't matter. Greg had loved Lily from the moment she was born, and Margaret had let that love carry on without ever questioning it. But now she wondered if that hidden truth had played a role in everything that was unraveling before her eyes. Was this why Greg had crossed the line? Had he somehow found out? Or did Lily herself learn the truth and use it to justify the relationship? Had the DNA test opened a door that should have stayed locked? The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity: the secrecy, the shift in behavior, the emotional detachment from Margaret. All of it began when Lily moved back and Greg discovered the one truth Margaret had hoped would never come out. It wasn't just betrayal, it was corruption from within. Margaret stopped thinking clearly after that. Her mind became clouded with images, voices, and fury. She stopped documenting things. There was no point anymore. The evidence had done its job. She didn't want to expose them to the world. She didn't want justice. She wanted silence. She wanted an ending. Still, she went about her daily routine as if nothing had changed. She packed lunches, cleaned the kitchen, answered emails. Greg continued to live in the same house. Lily continued to sleep in the garage apartment, and the neighborhood still believed in the illusion of their perfect home. But inside Margaret's heart, a fuse had been lit. She no longer saw them as family. She no longer saw herself as a wife or a mother. Something inside her had snapped, so quietly and deeply that even she couldn't hear it. What she was planning next, she didn't yet know, only that something had to be done. And when it happened, no one would see it coming. Margaret woke each day as if her body moved without her permission. She dressed, cleaned, cooked, smiled, all with an eerie calmness that didn't match the turmoil living in her chest. Her mind, once filled with warmth and routine, was now cold and mechanical, driven by a singular purpose. The household had become a stage, and she, the quiet actor waiting for her final scene. Every morning when she poured Greg's coffee or passed Lily in the hallway, she felt like she was standing next to strangers wearing masks. They were pretending, and so was she. The truth had hollowed her out. Knowing that Greg wasn't Lily's biological father had once been a private burden, a secret Margaret thought she'd buried forever. But now it felt like that one lie had poisoned everything. If she had told Greg back then, would things have turned out differently? Would he have kept the proper boundaries, known his place, stayed the father and not become something else? These thoughts circled in her mind like vultures over a rotting carcass. They didn't stop and they didn't let her sleep. Sometimes, in the quiet of early morning, she would sit in the garage, the door closed, the air heavy with exhaust fumes from Greg's old car. She wouldn't start the engine, at least, not yet. But she would sit there, breathing in the silence, picturing different outcomes. In one, she packed her things, vanished, and never looked back. In another, she exposed them both to the world and watched them burn under the public shame. But those fantasies always ended the same way. With her alone, her life in ruins, her heart still aching. Margaret began collecting small objects without quite knowing why. A lighter from the junk drawer, extra sleeping pills from the medicine cabinet, a bottle of drain cleaner. She wasn't thinking clearly, but some part of her was building something, a ritual, a plan, a monument to her suffering. Every item she stored in a shoebox under the bed felt like a piece of armor. One day, while doing laundry, Margaret found a small gold chain under the cushions of the living room sofa. It was delicate, with a tiny L pendant lilies. Greg must have given it to her. It wasn't expensive, but it was personal. Too personal. She stared at it for a long time before slipping it into her pocket and burning it later that night in the fire pit out back. No one noticed it was gone. The house itself began to feel haunted. Margaret walked through its rooms like a ghost, her footsteps silent, her presence unnoticed. Greg and Lily had their routines. He left for school. She worked on her laptop from the garage apartment or visited friends. Though Margaret suspected many of those visits were just cover for stolen moments with Greg, Margaret said nothing. But she saw everything. Her silence had become her strength. It made her invisible. One night she watched them through the living room window. Greg had gone into the garage apartment again, thinking no one was watching. Margaret stood in the shadows, unblinking, arms folded. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the flicker of the television, the silhouettes of two bodies sitting close together on the couch. There was no sound, just the heartbeat in her ears, steady and loud. She could have called the police. She had the photos, the texts, even the video footage. But Margaret didn't want justice in the eyes of the law. She wanted something more complete, something final. Every legal outcome she imagined left her unsatisfied. Greg in prison, Lily in therapy, reporters swarming the house. None of it undid what they'd taken from her. They hadn't just betrayed her, they had erased her place in her own life. The turning point came quietly. No dramatic moment, no trigger. Just a Tuesday evening, plain as any other. Margaret was folding laundry in the living room while Greg and Lily prepared dinner together in the kitchen. She listened to them joke and laugh, heard the sounds of pans clanging, the warmth in their voices. That warmth was what broke her. The realization that they still had joy, still had each other while she had nothing left. They had stolen everything and continued on as if she didn't exist. Later that night, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of printed texts and photos. She lit a single candle and watched the flame dance. Her face was calm, her eyes hollow. Then, one by one, she began to tear the papers. Not out of anger, but out of finality. She dropped them into the sink and set them alight, watching them curl into ash. She had decided. The next few days were unnervingly peaceful. She smiled more, cleaned the house with unusual energy, baked cookies for the neighbors. Greg commented on her improved mood. Lily mentioned how nice it was to see her happy again. Margaret nodded and thanked them, the words sliding out of her mouth like smoke. No one noticed the storm behind her smile. She began preparing the house without raising suspicion. She fixed the loose lock on the garage apartment door so it would open easily. She cleaned the family gun and placed it back where Greg usually kept it, but now it was loaded. She even changed the batteries in the smoke detectors. Not because she feared a fire, but because she didn't want anything to stop what she had in mind. She washed and ironed the same outfit she wore on their last family Christmas, a simple blue sweater and black slacks. She didn't know why, only that it felt right. She made a list of phone numbers and addresses, just in case someone needed to be notified afterward. She didn't write a note. There was nothing left to explain. Margaret wasn't angry anymore. The rage had passed. What remained was a sharp, chilling clarity. She no longer felt like a victim. She felt like the author of the final chapter. She watched the clock every night, waiting for the hour Greg would sneak into the garage apartment. She waited for Lily to shut the lights and play the same music that always accompanied their secret time together. It was all predictable now. A routine she could set her watch to. When the night finally came, she didn't hesitate. She took the gun, slipped on her coat, and walked outside. The grass was damp, the air cold, but her hands didn't shake. She approached the garage apartment, turned the doorknob slowly, and stepped inside. Greg and Lily were in bed. They didn't even hear her enter. For the first time in months, Margaret felt something close to peace. The room smelled of lavender and stale wine. A single lamp illuminated the small space, casting soft golden light across the walls. The garage apartment had once been used for storage, but since Lily returned from college, Greg had helped convert it into a cozy studio, her own private sanctuary, just a few steps from the house. To the world, it was a generous gesture from a supportive father. To Margaret, it had become the breeding ground of betrayal. As she stood silently in the doorway, her eyes adjusted to the dim glow. She saw them both in the bed, tangled beneath a shared blanket, breathing softly, unaware. Greg's arm was curled around Lily's waist, and Lily's head rested on his chest. They looked peaceful, intimate, like lovers, not family. The very sight pierced something deep within Margaret, but she didn't cry. Her face remained emotionless, carved from months of silence, denial, and bitter truth. She stepped forward, careful not to make a sound. The hardwood floor creaked faintly beneath her feet, but they didn't stir. They were too comfortable, too sure of the secrecy they thought they owned. Margaret's grip on the gun remained firm, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard. She stood at the foot of the bed for several seconds, watching them, breathing them in. The people she had loved more than anything in the world had become strangers, distorted, and unrecognizable. She thought for a moment about walking away, about returning to the main house, locking herself in the bathroom, and sobbing into a towel. She imagined herself packing a bag and fleeing to another state, starting over where no one knew her name. But none of those paths felt real anymore. Her life, as it had been, was already gone. This was not a moment she could escape. It was the moment everything had been building toward. Margaret raised the gun. She didn't yell. She didn't hesitate. The first shot struck Greg in the chest. The sound was thunderous in the small space, shaking the framed photos on the wall. His eyes jolted open, confused, wide with pain. Before he could speak, a second shot struck his shoulder. He let out a muffled gasp, blood beginning to soak through the blanket. Lily screamed, bolting upright in bed, eyes darting toward the sound, toward the shadow in the doorway. She clutched the blanket to her chest, her breath catching in her throat when she realized who it was. Margaret looked at her daughter, the girl she had carried for 9 months, nursed, raised, protected. The same girl who had now become something else entirely. Lily's eyes pleaded, her mouth moving without sound. Margaret didn't blink. The third shot tore through Lily's abdomen. She crumpled forward, hands pressed to her stomach, blood seeping between her fingers. Greg groaned beside her, his body twitching weakly. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Margaret lowered the gun. The room reeked of gunpowder and something metallic. The world around her moved in slow motion. She looked at the mess on the bed, the blood-soaked sheets, the trembling limbs, the eyes full of terror. Neither was dead yet, but both were fading fast. Greg tried to reach for Lily, his hand brushing hers before going limp. Lily's head rolled to the side, her lips stained red, her gaze unfocused. Margaret backed away, her breath shallow and uneven. She didn't remember leaving the apartment, only that she found herself walking barefoot across the lawn moments later. The grass was cool against her feet. A dog barked in the distance. Wind rustled the trees. The world outside continued like nothing had happened. Inside, everything had changed. She placed the gun on the porch step and sat down beside it. Her hands were sticky with blood. Her sweater, once her favorite, now bore the crimson marks of what she had done. She stared at the driveway, the silent street, the dark sky overhead. Time passed. How much she didn't know. When the neighbors called 911, prompted by the sound of gunfire, Margaret didn't flinch at the flashing lights. Police arrived first, followed by paramedics. Margaret didn't move when the officers shouted commands. She raised her hand slowly and spoke the only words she would say that night. "I shot them." The officers moved cautiously, securing the scene, checking the garage apartment where they found Greg and Lily both unresponsive. The EMTs worked quickly, but neither victim survived the ride to the hospital. The news spread fast. A double homicide in a quiet neighborhood, a respected nurse and wife behind the trigger. Reporters camped outside the home by morning, speculating wildly. Was it domestic abuse? A love triangle? Mental illness? The truth, though known only to Margaret and her folders of evidence, was far more disturbing than anyone guessed. At the station, Margaret gave a full confession. She told the detectives everything: how she discovered the messages, the photos, the DNA results. She described the nights of silence, the betrayal, the hopelessness. Her tone never changed. There were no tears. Just the exhausted voice of a woman who had carried too much for too long. She handed over the printed screenshots and recordings she had hidden away. One detective, hardened by years of similar cases, looked visibly shaken as he flipped through them. The department brought in a forensic psychologist who declared Margaret emotionally detached but not insane. She had known what she was doing. She had planned it. Public reaction was chaotic. Some labeled her a monster, a jealous wife who lost control. Others, upon learning the details, saw her as a tragic figure, a woman so deeply wounded by betrayal that she broke in the most violent way. But no one could ignore the horror of it. A mother shooting her own child, a wife killing her husband. The lines of right and wrong blurred until there was nothing but red. In jail, Margaret remained silent. She declined interviews. She refused visitors. She requested only one thing: to be left alone. Her trial date was set, but the outcome, for many, was already decided. She was guilty. The only question was how harsh the sentence would be. Still, in her cell at night, Margaret stared at the concrete ceiling and thought about the silence. The silence of that final moment in the apartment, the silence after the shots, the silence that followed years of secrets. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to discover. No more whispers, no more lies. Just the truth and the price it demanded. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters lined the halls, cameras flashed outside, and curious onlookers waited for any glimpse of the woman at the center of one of the most disturbing family crimes the town had ever seen. Margaret Harris sat at the defense table, her hair pulled back neatly, wearing the same calm expression she had worn the night she surrendered to the police. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She simply stared ahead, hands folded in her lap, as if the world around her was no longer hers to engage with. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer, a jealous, manipulative woman who had discovered a forbidden affair between her husband and daughter and chosen to murder them, rather than deal with it like a rational person. They showed pictures of the crime scene, presented autopsy reports, and highlighted the evidence that proved premeditation. The gun had been cleaned and loaded days in advance. She had stalked their movements. She had burned the incriminating texts and photos in the kitchen sink. This was not a moment of madness. The prosecutor argued this was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The defense, however, told a different story. They didn't deny what Margaret had done. There was no point. Instead, they focused on the emotional devastation she had suffered in the months leading up to the crime. They detailed the contents of the phone messages, the photographs, and the DNA results. They spoke of the betrayal, the moral collapse, the erosion of trust between a mother, a daughter, and a husband. The defense attorney described Margaret as a woman psychologically crushed beneath the weight of secrecy, humiliation, and despair. Expert witnesses were brought in. A psychologist testified that Margaret had experienced a prolonged traumatic episode, describing it as an emotional break compounded by years of suppressed guilt. a toxic household dynamic, and an unimaginable breach of familial boundaries. The jury listened in stunned silence as the story unfolded layer by layer. Testimony after testimony revealed the twisted timeline. Lily had discovered the truth about her paternity 2 years before moving back home. The DNA test she took on a whim had opened a door that should have remained closed. Greg, after being confronted with the results, had gradually distanced himself from Margaret and grown closer to Lily in ways that defied every definition of normalcy. Their relationship, hidden under the pretense of father-daughter closeness, had evolved into something deeply disturbing. It was clear that Margaret had tried to hold it together. She hadn't lashed out the moment she found the texts. She hadn't stormed into the apartment the night she first saw Greg slip inside. She had endured it, documenting everything, waiting for some answer that never came. In court, her attorney read excerpts from Margaret's personal journal, short, heartbreaking entries written in her handwriting, filled with despair and disorientation. One read, "I keep waiting to wake up, but this nightmare is real. They look me in the eye and lie as if I don't matter." When the prosecution questioned Margaret on the stand, she answered simply and directly. She didn't try to justify what she had done. She admitted to everything. But when asked why, her voice wavered for the first time. "Because they made me disappear," she said. "They erased me and expected me to pretend nothing was happening. I was already dead to them." Those words echoed through the courtroom like a final breath. After weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. Outside, the public was divided. News coverage portrayed the case as everything from a twisted domestic tragedy to a modern Greek tragedy. True crime podcasts picked up the story, analyzing it from every angle. Was it justified rage or calculated revenge? Was Margaret a villain or a victim? The jury returned after 3 days. Margaret was found guilty of second-degree murder for both Greg and Lily. The judge, acknowledging the psychological complexity of the case, sentenced her to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. Some called it merciful. Others called it insufficient. Margaret showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She stood, nodded once, and was led away in handcuffs. The house on Aspen Lane sat empty for months before being quietly sold to a new family. The neighbors avoided speaking about the tragedy. Some moved away entirely, unwilling to live near the place where something so dark had taken place. The garage apartment was torn down by the new owners, who said it gave them a bad feeling. Margaret's hospital job was terminated. Her name was scrubbed from employee boards and websites. Greg and Lily were buried in a private cemetery in separate plots with no headstones for weeks. Eventually, small markers were added, but few visited. Years passed. The public's memory faded as new scandals took their place in the headlines. Margaret, now inmate number 47,825 at the Women's Correctional Facility in Pueblo, became known among the staff as quiet and reserved. She taught health and hygiene classes, kept to herself, and never spoke about the past. She received no letters, no visitors. Her life became a routine of silence, exactly like the one that had preceded the killings. But this time, it felt deserved. In a rare interview granted to a local reporter for a prison documentary, Margaret was asked if she regretted what she had done. She paused for a long time before answering. "I regret not leaving," she finally said. "I regret not packing a bag and walking out that night, but I don't regret ending the lies. I couldn't keep living in a house where everything I loved had been corrupted." The clip aired only once but was shared across the internet. Some called her cold, others brave. But no one denied the haunting sadness in her voice. Today, the story remains a cautionary tale whispered in true crime circles. A mother who became a murderer, a family consumed by secrets. A truth that festered until it exploded. People like to think evil comes from strangers, from monsters lurking in shadows. But sometimes, the darkest truths grow quietly in living rooms, behind white picket fences, in families that seem perfect. And when those truths come to light, they don't just destroy relationships. They destroy lives.